Donniel Hartman.
Good evening. What causes an individual or a nation to underperform morally and to deviate from their moral identity and ethical standards? A default answer can always be the inherent capacity of humankind to do evil, to be moral underachievers. As Genesis chapter 8 states, the inclination of the human heart is evil from its youth. As Jews, we're not surprised by moral failure or mediocrity. This is the everlasting lesson of the Shoah. The most advanced of societies can be the most morally corrupt. No one is immune. But what causes this failure to emerge at particular times? Why now? Western democracies around the world are increasingly exhibiting a political discourse which is antithetical to their commitment to equal rights, to equality and human rights. In Israel over the last few years, there are a number of emerging trends which are deeply, deeply troubling. 50% of Israeli high school students now believe that Arabs should not have a right to vote. 60% of the adult population believes that it's justified to discriminate between Jews and Arabs. And 60% of Israeli Jews believe that the soldier in Hebron should not be tried for his actions. I'm not prejudging him as guilty. But what justification can there be for not even wanting to judge him in the first place? Life in Israel, like that in many Western countries, is increasingly being shaped by a consciousness of fear and the politics of fear which feeds on it. As individuals, we have only a limited control over the realities, both objective and subjective, which generate this fear, and have great difficulty objectively assessing whether we are in greater danger today and whether the threat is now more existential. However, if we understand how fear works to alter our moral sensibilities, we can control the way we talk about it and to some extent control some of its power over our lives. So let's talk about fear and cultivate what I hope is a nuanced discourse about its features and qualities. Fear is first and foremost a vision modifier. In its first stage, it instinctively causes us to go into defensive mode, which entails the shifting of our attention and resources to our own immediate needs in order to protect ourselves from a real or supposed danger. In doing so, fear inherently undermines our moral sensibilities, which are grounded on an ability and willingness to see others, their pain, their needs, and to respond accordingly. Fear is a vision modifier, moving our primary sphere of concern from the other to ourselves. The fear can be over personal security, national security, job security, financial security. It all works the same. When fear is present, my needs come first. This move is instinctive and is not only critical to the survival of the species, but paradoxically, also our foundational moral responsibility. To love one's neighbor as oneself is only possible if there is a oneself. And in times of danger, our moral duty to ourselves does take precedence. How then does fear change our moral DNA? As a vision modifier, fear does not merely shift the focus of our attention from the other to ourselves. In stage 2, it does not simply influence whether we see the other, but how we see them. Fear can lead to anger, anger to hatred, hatred to vilification, vilification to denigration, and denigration to demonization. The Jewish tradition at times falls prey to this precise slippery slope, and at times is acutely aware of its danger. As the angels began to sing to God a song of praise for God's drowning of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea, an army which sought either to kill or re-enslave the children of Israel, our rabbis placed the following words in God's mouth: "The creation of my hands is drowning in the sea, and you think it's appropriate to sing a song of praise? A human being created in the image of God does not lose their status even when they are our enemy. While actions of self-defense are morally required, this does not legitimize the denigration of anyone who's God's creation. This is not some Pollyannish assertion, but is in fact the foundation of all morality in war. The obligation to not merely limit our wars to wars of self-defense, but to commit to fighting those wars justly. While some argue that morality in war is an oxymoron, and that the only obligation in war is to win, this moral category is actually one of the distinguishing characteristics of a civilized military, and the critical distinction between it and a group of terrorists. Today, this moral commitment is no longer a standard to be borne only by the soldier in the battlefield. In our war against terror, a war in which the battlefront is in our cities and our homes, we all have to develop this moral awareness. However, fear has its greater impact on civilian moral consciousness when it evolves into stage 3, when it becomes contagious. Fear rarely causes us to attack only those who are its instigators. It spreads to those who look like them, to those who believe like them, to those who come from where they have come. While we immunize those who are like us from such contagion, fear inspires us to attack those who are not like us. It is valuable to remember here the infamous words of Haman, the paradigm of Amalekite evil. There is a certain people whose laws are different from those of any other people. It's not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. Let an edict be drawn to destroy them. While we fear Haman, we are all susceptible to becoming like him. Now, in its most aggressive form as a vision modifier, fear ultimately comes back and changes the way we see ourselves. The greatest casualty of stage 4 fear is that it attacks us and limits our ability to hope. In stage 1, fear is actually an engine of hope. The pain it generates activates a yearning for a future free from such pain, a yearning for a new and better day, a day in which justice will reign throughout the land and the wolf and the lamb will lie down side by side at peace with each other. However, when fear leads to hatred, vilification, and demonization, hope loses the oxygen it needs to survive. For now, the other can and will never change. If evil is intrinsic to their DNA, if by the laws of nature Esau will always hate Jacob, there is no hope. Not only will there not be peace now, but there will also not be peace tomorrow. All we can hope for is the vanquishing and destruction of the other, or the search for walls and iron domes that will create a status quo in which we are protected from the harm that the evil inevitably hurl in our direction. It is here that fear has the greatest effect on our moral souls. Hope, unlike fear, is not principally an emotion. It's a place. A place where not only is the world as it should be, but a place where, as individuals and as a community, we are who we ought to be. Hope is the foundation for moral aspirations. We are all sinners. And since to be human is to err, to never be able to fully fulfill our moral obligations, we are exposed to the inclination to idealize who we are and transform it into who we ought to be. It's a different form of the is-ought fallacy. Realism is not merely an awareness of reality as it is, but often morphs into an assessment of what will always be. Realism could thus not merely recognize human failings, but come to idealize them as inevitable. Hope is the enemy of realism, for it speaks of that which can be. Hope is to place what Shabbat is to time. 6 days a week we toil and work, and the realities of everyday life define our sense of self and others. On the 7th day we rest and enter into a day of holiness, a day in which our primary responsibility is to be different from who we were. The purpose of this cycle is not to create a schizophrenic soul, but one in which the consciousness of Shabbat slowly permeates our everyday life and erases the dichotomy. We need a Shabbat to ensure that the realities of everyday existence do not define and exhaust the meaning of our lives. In the same way, we need a place of hope to ensure that the realities of everyday existence do not define and exhaust the moral expectations for our own lives. Because of fear, we have stopped hoping. We pray for peace, but have ceased to expect its realization. Our fear has mired us into a status quo of survival. While a status quo may be a political possibility, especially when world geopolitical interests are focused elsewhere, there is no such thing as a moral status quo. While the situation may stay the same for a while, we do not. Without hope, we are in danger of losing hope, not merely for ourselves, but about ourselves. There are many in religious and political leadership who peddle in fear and hope at the same time. What they attempt to sell is a narrative that if we become fearful, then and only then will there be hope. If we're appropriately fearful, then and only then there will be hope that we will prevail. They speak to our legitimate fears, but unleash its vile manifestations. Hope cannot be constructed from the building blocks of fear. Its foundation must be our commitment to a vision of the world as we want it to be, and to ourselves as we ought to be. It does not live in an active will. It needs to be fed by a political discourse and policies which reflect a commitment to such a world. We need to free ourselves from our addiction to the supposed safety of the status quo. I know we tried to achieve peace in the past, and they said no. So we need to try, and if needed, try again. Our task is not to bring peace now, but to never accept a language or a policy which will make it impossible tomorrow. We need to reinstitute a values discourse which speaks of the rights we owe others and not merely those we owe ourselves. It's not in our hands alone to actualize our dreams. It is in our hands to ensure that these dreams remain alive. We are at a difficult time in Israel's history. The dangers are great, and naivete is a luxury we will not endure. We need fear in order to survive, but will not outlive its multiple manifestations. To embody the necessary and required measure of fear, but sustain a place where hope can thrive, is the challenge of modern Israel. We have always recognized the place of hope in enabling our national rebirth. We gave homage to hope in our national anthem. It's time to control the discourse of fear in our society and reclaim the place of hope in our national character. We have done so in the past. It's time to do so for our future. Thank you.
Donniel Hartman, everybody.